The year was 1530, and Florence was a city brimming with art, ambition, and the murmurs of revolution. It was a time when men like me, Leonardo da Vinci, were expected to leave their mark, if not with a paintbrush, then with a contraption, an invention, or a theory. But what they didn't realize, in all their talk of flying machines and anatomical drawings, was that the greatest discoveries were often hidden beneath the surface, like the stars that only reveal themselves to those who dare look beyond the horizon. It was late one evening when I first heard the name Nicolaus Copernicus, a name that would become synonymous with danger, brilliance, and the very unraveling of the universe itself. I had been traveling in secret. My fame, though considerable, was hardly enough to protect me from the prying eyes of the Inquisition. My days were spent constructing intricate war machines for the Sforza family, but my nights were devoted to a more personal quest. I had always been drawn to the heavens. I had written much about the principles of flight, the mechanics of light, and the orbits of the stars. But the idea of a sun-centered universe, that was something beyond even my most extravagant ideas. It was through a series of whispered conversations in the shadowed corners of the city that I learned of Copernicus's work. A monk, a professor of mathematics, and a secretive philosopher, Copernicus had come to a conclusion that would change everything. The Earth, he suggested, was not the center of the universe. No, the sun held that place. The Earth, along with the other planets, circled it in an elegant dance that defied centuries of belief. His theories were bold, blasphemous even. But the more I heard, the more I realized this was not merely a scientific theory. It was a challenge to the very fabric of the world as we knew it, and, of course, a challenge to the Church itself. I remember the first time I met Copernicus. It was not in a grand hall or amidst the galleries of Florence, but in a small, dimly lit room on the outskirts of the city. His reputation had preceded him, and his eyes held the weight of someone who knew the world could no longer stay as it was. "I know what you're thinking," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Church will never allow it. But what if the world is wrong? What if the sun is the center?" It was the question that had haunted me in my studies, the question that even my art had tried to answer. I had always felt there was something more, something beneath the surface of what we saw, something hidden from the average man. I had peered into the movements of the planets, studied their motions, but had always found myself at odds with the idea that the Earth could be the center of all things. It felt wrong. Copernicus's words felt like an answer I had been searching for. "Your theory," I said, "it has power. But it is a dangerous power. The world is not ready to accept that the heavens do not revolve around us." He nodded solemnly. "I know. I am a simple man, Leonardo, and I only seek the truth. But I fear for my life. The Church, they would burn me for this. I am only one man against an institution that has ruled for centuries." And that's when I knew my part in this story. I was not just an artist. I was more than a painter of grand masterpieces. I was a man who understood the machinery of the world, how things moved, how they could be made to work differently. If Copernicus was to survive, if his ideas were to live on, I had to act. "I will help you," I promised, my voice firm. "But we must work in secret. If you are to spread your word, it will have to be done through whispers, through codes, and through the minds of those who see beyond the veil." The night was still, but the air hummed with the tension of what was to come. Copernicus handed me a small, leather-bound notebook, a collection of his thoughts, his drawings, his observations. It was not just theory, but the beginning of something revolutionary. In that moment, I realized that I was about to risk everything for a man and an idea that might forever change the world. The next few years would be filled with uncertainty. Copernicus would remain in the shadows, publishing nothing, and I would do my best to protect him. But this was only the beginning. The world was not ready for what we were about to unleash, yet perhaps, in our darkest moments, the stars would guide us, as they had guided me all my life. And in those stars, I saw the truth waiting to be set free. I had helped bring the world to new heights before. This time, I would help the world reach for the heavens themselves. The following months were filled with a quiet sort of chaos, covert meetings, hastily scribbled notes, and the steady hum of something much bigger than ourselves stirring in the undercurrents of the Renaissance. Copernicus remained hidden in the small villages of northern Italy, carefully maintaining the illusion of a simple scholar, while I, ever the master of blending in with the shadows, set about ensuring his survival and his work's eventual dissemination. I had already begun to formulate a plan, using my network of contacts and my ingenuity to develop devices that would not only aid in the study of the heavens, but also obscure their true purpose, instruments that could both assist Copernicus and protect him. My reputation as an inventor and artist was known far and wide, but few realized the depths of my scientific pursuits. It was this very reputation that would allow me to operate in the shadows, reaching out to those who shared an interest in science but kept their allegiances close to their chest. I knew that the church's reach was vast, and their suspicion of new ideas, particularly those that questioned the geocentric model, was not to be taken lightly. I had seen the consequences of questioning the divine order firsthand. A burning stake or an excommunication were the least of one's worries when one stood against the might of the papacy. Copernicus, though brilliant, was vulnerable. His work could not be allowed to die in the quiet corners of libraries. It needed to be spread, but it had to be done with great caution. I began by reaching out to my old network of scholars and thinkers, men who had crossed my path in the past, men who would be willing to listen to Copernicus's ideas. Some were reluctant at first, fearful of the implications, but they had seen the glint of truth in the stars before, just as I had. Slowly, they came around, one by one, drawn to the logic and reason behind Copernicus' heliocentric theory. They were, like me, searching for something more. The first of these was Paolo Toscanelli, an esteemed cartographer and geographer, a man whose name was respected in academic circles. I met him under the guise of discussing the geographical advancements I had made, maps of places I had never visited, all drawn from my own observations and theories. In truth, I sought to use the art of mapping as a means of studying the cosmos. When Toscanelli saw the device I had crafted, a celestial sphere, a mechanical model of the stars and planets, arranged in a way that allowed one to chart their movements in a way the Church's teachings never could, his skepticism melted away. "This," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "this changes everything. I've never seen anything like it." It was in these moments that I realized the power of the underground network I was slowly assembling. We weren't just talking about the stars. We were talking about revolution. Each one of us, whether a humble scholar or an aristocratic patron, became part of the great clandestine movement that would shape history. We would speak in hushed tones, and we would use the very tools of our trade, science, art, and knowledge, to protect the fragile flame of Copernicus' work. By the summer of 1532, I had perfected the first of what I would call the star tables. These were not merely astronomical charts, but coded documents, hidden messages within the data. The stars would become our secret language, a means by which we could pass along information about Copernicus' work to those who dared question the Church. They were not simple maps. They were a key to unlocking the knowledge that lay buried in the heavens. But it was not only scholars who were listening. I had become friends with many who held power, men who ruled over towns and regions, and men who had the means to protect us. The Medici, though politically unstable at the time, had always been patrons of the arts, and I knew that I could count on them. But I had to be cautious. Medici loyalty was a fickle thing, and I was not so naive as to think that my ties to the family would be enough to protect Copernicus from the inevitable storm. So I went to work in secret. I forged an alliance with a man named Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar with a strong voice and even stronger convictions. Though his views were not always aligned with mine, his position allowed him to influence others, and more importantly, he had the ear of the right people. I had no delusions about the Church's reach, but I also knew that the power of faith was not easily swayed by reason alone. Savonarola, like many of his contemporaries, was a man caught between the old world and the new. He saw the signs of corruption in the Church, yet he also understood the danger of upsetting the established order too quickly. He did not believe in Copernicus' theory, but he saw the wisdom in supporting it, quietly, in secret. So we came to an agreement. Copernicus' work would be shared, but we would do so in ways that would not provoke immediate backlash. We began spreading Copernicus' work through a network of trusted individuals. Books and manuscripts, carefully copied and passed through the hands of those loyal to the cause, made their way into the hands of sympathetic scholars and aristocrats. These men, although few in number, would be the ones who could later influence the tide of history. They would be the ones who could bring Copernicus's work into the light. But there were risks that I did not take lightly. I had known the consequences of defying authority in the past. I had been a target of the Church before, and my actions had been closely watched. I had to move carefully, calculating each step with the precision I had once used in my paintings. Every decision had to be made with the utmost caution. Yet, as I studied the stars through the lenses of my new inventions and carefully coded manuscripts, I began to feel something I had not felt in years, the thrill of discovery. I knew that Copernicus's theory would shake the foundations of the world, but I also knew that the world was not ready for such a shift. Not yet. In the silence of my workshop, surrounded by my inventions, I thought of Copernicus. I thought of the quiet man who had dared to imagine the impossible. He was out there, waiting for the right moment, and I would do everything in my power to ensure that moment came. The years passed in a blur of whispered conversations, coded letters, and secret meetings. As I worked tirelessly to protect Copernicus's theory, the world around us began to shift. The Renaissance was in full bloom, and with it, the fervor of intellectual exploration. Yet, The shadows of the Inquisition loomed ever closer, ready to strike down anything that threatened the established order. I had always been a master of shadows, but even I knew that the time for secrecy was running thin. In 1535, news reached me that Copernicus was finally preparing to publish his work. The book, titled De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, was a masterpiece of scientific thought, presenting the heliocentric theory as the true structure of the universe. It was the culmination of years of quiet work, and I could sense the urgency in his letters. He knew that the book would send shock waves through Europe, and he feared the wrath of the Church. His trust in me was unwavering, but the reality was setting in. The storm we had so carefully avoided for years was about to break. I had spent countless hours, days, and weeks helping him perfect his arguments. We had gone over the celestial models again and again, making sure they were as flawless as possible, but also ensuring they would be difficult to refute. Each new mathematical proof we developed was another weapon in the quiet war we were waging, not just for the truth, but for Copernicus's survival. But I had to prepare for the worst. The book was bound to attract the attention of the Vatican. The Church would not tolerate the undermining of its authority, particularly when it came from a man as influential as Copernicus. I began to prepare countermeasures. I arranged for copies of the book to be smuggled to influential scholars in Venice, Paris, and even as far as Spain. These copies would not be widely distributed immediately. No, the time for open rebellion had not yet arrived. But they would circulate among those who could protect Copernicus, those who could read between the lines, and those who would later be able to defend him when the inevitable attacks came. I also arranged for some of the scientific equipment I had created, the star tables, the telescopes, and the celestial spheres, to be distributed to trusted allies. These tools would be invaluable in further proving Copernicus's theory to the world. In the meantime, I kept a close watch on Florence and the surrounding regions. The political situation was tense, and the Medici were struggling to maintain control. Florence was no longer the hub of power it once was, and there were whispers of revolt, of change. The Church, despite its power, could not suppress all ideas, especially when they were supported by the scientific minds of the time. Then, in the winter of 1536, the storm we had feared finally broke. The Vatican issued a formal condemnation of De Revolutionibus. The Church denounced the book as heretical, citing its challenge to the geocentric model as an affront to the divine order. The Inquisition was already moving, and I could feel the weight of their gaze upon me. But I was prepared. We had prepared for this. The first attack came swiftly. Copernicus's book was banned, its copies seized, and any scholar found in possession of it was to be imprisoned. It was exactly as we had anticipated. Yet, the beauty of Copernicus's theory was that it could not be easily silenced. The ideas had already taken root in the minds of a few brave souls who had seen the truth. It would take time, but the seeds of revolution had been planted. As I moved through the streets of Florence, I kept my head low. The Church had no idea how deeply their roots had already been weakened. The same system that had once placed us in servitude to the divine order was now struggling to suppress the very minds that had raised us to greatness. Science was no longer a curiosity or a hobby. It had become a weapon, a force capable of toppling empires. In the years that followed, Copernicus' work slowly made its way out of the shadows into the open. It began to influence the minds of a new generation of thinkers. Scholars in Italy, France, and even England began to publicly defend the heliocentric theory. The Church, for all its power, could not control the flow of ideas. The heliocentric model would eventually win, though not in my lifetime and not in Copernicus's lifetime. But the change had already begun. It was not until 1543, after Copernicus's death, that the world fully embraced his theory. By then, the gears of history had already begun to turn. The Renaissance had laid the foundation, and men like Galileo, Kepler, and Newton would later build on the work that Copernicus and I had quietly set in motion. But it was the quiet revolution, the slow, steady trickle of knowledge, that ultimately proved victorious. In the years that followed, I returned to my art and my inventions. The world had changed, and I had played my part in shaping that change. The stars no longer seemed as distant as they once had. The universe, though still vast and mysterious, had become a little more knowable, a little more human. But I never forgot the price of revolution, the price of truth. Copernicus had risked everything for his ideas. He had lived and died in the shadow of the Church, his name nearly lost to time. Yet in the end, it was his courage, his vision, and his unwavering belief in the power of knowledge that had changed the course of history. And though I had been a silent ally, it was enough for me to know that together we had ignited the spark that would one day light the way for generations to come. The world had changed, and I had helped to change it, not with grand speeches or violent protests, but with whispers, with shadows, and with the quiet power of ideas. And sometimes I think that the greatest revolutions are the ones we never see coming, the ones that start in the darkness and over time light the way for the rest of the world.